idea how nice it is actually to be back. So before I even talk about the thanks, just to note where we are. I mean, I see my friends and my students from the East Asian Studies, College of East Asian Studies, but those of you for whom this is the first time in this building, we are so privileged to be able to launch this particular lecture series in this particular building that has such important associations for me, but I think for Wesleyan, to the Freeman family, and beyond that to what does it mean to study East Asia or Asia in a larger world context. So you have in this extraordinarily gracious room that echoes Japanese and Chinese aesthetics. I've showed to my dear friend Nathan Katz, the beautiful meditation garden at the Tatami room. The art, Eiko, William Johnston, I guess that's a forbidden city from this angle. And just looking at the mixture of Chinese and Jewish students in this room, it's really a joy to see this. It's unique. It's unique what happens at Wesleyan. And I'm very, very grateful to be part of this new idea that hopefully will be part of the Schwarcz lecture series. When I retired a year ago, and I think those of you who were at my last lecture, you know that I've been concerned about, and I would go so far as aggrieved by what has become the narrow definition of critical thought on some campuses, including and sometimes at Wesleyan. That there's a notion of deconstructing beliefs, deconstructing cultures, developing an attitude of objective criticism, objective entre guillemets, in quotation marks, because never fully objective. But the question is, what is left after the ravage of so-called critical thought? And we often find a debris of belief, of understanding. And I felt this keen need to rebuild the conversation about how we can use the powers of intellectual reflection on various traditions, be those Confucian, Jewish, Indian, Buddhist, Shinto, the ones at least that I'm somewhat familiar with, to think about them in a way that is not simply corrosive, but allows us to engage them in a deeper conversation. And I was very heartened in my last tea with the university president, Michael Roth, who has been an architect of deconstructionist and critical thought, who's rethinking his own legacy in the more negative implications of critical thought, such as suggested to Rabbi Levi that next year or the year after we should have Michael Roth as the Schwarcz lecturer. I think it would be exciting, and I hope he does it. I could not have thought of a more meaningful way to launch the lecture series than having my dear friend and distinguished Professor Nathan Katz. But before I introduce Nathan Katz, I do want to thank the visionary that Rabbi Levi Sheckman has been at Wesleyan, and those of you who have been able to help him. He's moved his family, his wife, his 3 children, and serves the Wesleyan community full-heartedly, without pay, in all the kinds of different needs, including deepening the conversation, be that about Kabbalah or various primary sources in the Jewish tradition. So it was really his effort, and including his wonderful mother who did the homemade goodies that are outside that people continue to savor. So I want to honor the vision of you and your wife and the devotion that you have dedicated to the students and to the university to make this possible. So with no further ado, I met Nathan Katz many years ago when we were working on one of the first conferences on Chinese-Jewish conversation. It was at Harvard. Benjamin Schwartz was still alive, and there was a gathering of the, we're just beginning to think about the Chinese-Jewish experience, both in terms of the Kaifeng and the Holocaust period and philosophical exchanges. And Nathan Katz was there to remind us that there's another part to the Asian connection and relationship to kind of the Jewish experience in the diaspora, and that's the Indian experience. And it's very similar and significantly different. The Jews of India had a very, very different and interesting tradition that echoes some of the things that happen in China and are strikingly different. So that's when I met him, and I've been indebted to his view. In the long time, Nathan Katz is really the founder of Indian studies in America, one of the first with a PhD from Temple University, just reminding me that he taught at Amherst for a while, and really found a very, very welcoming and liberating environment at Florida International University, where his interest in entrepreneurship and spirituality ended up launching the first undergraduate program in spirituality, and also bringing the Dalai Lama repeatedly to the southern parts of the United States in very distinguished and meaningful conversations. It's very easy to have photographs taken with the Dalai Lama. It's much harder to talk about what is the conversation really about. And so I am incredibly grateful that Nathan Katz left sunny Florida, left to Boston, no cars, came to New Haven by train, came to Middletown, and just really a daunting journey. Thank you very much for being here.
You just used the word honor. I should use another word, but I can't think of one. Can you hear me just fine? Am I loud enough? To be the inaugural speaker in the Vera Schwarcz lecture series. You just reminded me that we met at that Harvard conference the first time. And that conference provoked me, because it was on China and the Jews, something like that, and my expertise is in India and the Jews. So I ended up crafting, I thought, a fairly nice study of a comparison of the Jewish communities in Kaifeng and in Cochin, the oldest Jewish communities in China and India, respectively, and parallels and divergences, of course. Rabbi Levy, thank you so much for braving the roads to pick me up at impromptu at the New Haven train station today, and for putting this all together. And Professor Schwarcz, I don't have to tell you, she's a leading figure in understanding classical Chinese thought, and is very knowledgeable about Judaic thought and Judaic traditions. And right away, we realized we were sort of parallels or mirror images almost of one another. My work with Judaism and India, and hers with Judaism in China. I'm just, snow and freezing rain and sleet and hail will not stop the delivery of this talk anyway. So thank you so much, and to be able to honor you in any way brings me great joy. So critical thought should be a way of getting us to be able to dig deeper than the surface. That to me is what critical thought means. I know the trends and the fads in the academic world, which I think are somewhat destructive of values and culture. But of course, I'm committed to critical thought. I am a scholar. So critical thought should get us underneath the surface. What do we really talk about? So I want to describe to you tonight a conversation with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. This conversation took place in 1990, and it was captured, I thought, rather articulately in a book called The Jew in the Lotus, which is a play on words. There's a Tibetan mantra, the jewel is in the lotus. The jewel meaning the Buddha mind, the lotus meaning the ordinary mind. But so many Jews get involved with the Dharma that what's the Jew doing in the lotus? So Roger Kamnitz, the author, came along with us on this journey to see the Dalai Lama in 1990. And he came up with a clever title, but the book is more than clever. So I'm going to read to you a fair amount tonight, and I'll comment. I realized that in 1990, the Dalai Lama invited 8 Jewish scholars and rabbis to come and be his guests in Dharamshala in northern India, because he wanted to know what he called the Jewish secret, and that's the title, as you saw, of how does a people preserve a culture and an identity after the loss of a home. Every very old religion, Judaism, Hinduism, traditional Chinese religions, have a kind of relationship to a land that you don't find in newer religions, Christianity, most of Buddhism, Islam, and those religions aren't tied to a land except maybe for pilgrimage, but they spread around the world. Well, Judaism spread around the world by accident, as it were. But this sense of connectedness to land is the first point we need to understand and appreciate. It's common in very traditional religions. And then the question is provoked. What happens when a people so tied to a land leave their land or expelled from the land? Or what happens in the conditions of diaspora? So when in 1959, when about 100,000 Tibetans left Tibet to take up residence in India, they were worried. India is a big, strange place if you're Tibetan. And how do we manage to live as Tibetans outside of Tibet? That's the question. And the Dalai Lama figured that we better ask the Jews this question, because they lived without their land for 1,900 years, and when conditions made it possible, came back and rebuilt their land. That's inspiring to Tibetans, as we learn. So we went, rabbis of Hasidic, modern Orthodox, Reconstructionist, Renewal, all sorts of rabbis, and secular scholars such as myself, went to try to address the Dalai Lama's question. And one of the first things when we got there is, what on earth are we going to tell him? Well, how did we? So, let me bring you back into the text a little bit now. We gathered in New Delhi, and we got 4 taxi cabs to drive 15 hours overnight to Dharamshala. We're riding in a 4-car convoy, driving from Delhi to Dharamshala. And sharing the taxi I'm in is Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, whom some of you have heard of, I assume, a very charismatic, Hasidic trained, in the Lubavitch tradition, renegade rabbi, who started what is often called the Jewish Renewal Movement. The Jewish Renewal Movement is like many modernized forms of religion. He's the font with both the traditional background and the spirit of the New Age. He's in the cab, as is Rabbi Jonathan Omerman, who is a meditation teacher of Jewish meditation, where he has a school in Los Angeles. And we're driving through the night, which is a little odd anyway. We just gotten there. And we're talking about, well, how do we answer this question? So the conversation just naturally comes to theology of exile. And I tell them about a Tibetan prophecy from the 8th century that foretold the destruction of Buddhism in Tibet and its reestablishment in the land of the red-faced people, which all Tibetans and pretty much everyone takes to refer to the Americas. I tell them more how, according to the law of karma, all actions in this world bear moral results, and that many Tibetans understand the loss of their homeland as a consequence of their centuries of self-imposed isolation. When Tibet needed diplomatic friends, she had none. But they found meaning in their exile when they discovered that they're spreading out to Europe and America and Australia and so forth. Their exile led to the spread of Buddhist teachings to lands where they were not there. So they figured there is definitely some benefit to the world in what they considered their personal tragedies. Now, we Jews have this idea that we are a light unto the nations from the prophet Isaiah, that we were forced into exile, and instead of giving up, and in those days, well, their God is better than our God, so they're right and we're wrong, or however most people at that time would have dealt with that issue, Isaiah says, no, it's the same God who we worshipped in Israel, who oversees our exile into Babylonia, and we're here for a reason. And that reason is to make knowledge of God available to the wider world. The parallels, I think, are obvious. Another topic as we're driving, Jonathan, who teaches meditation, is very intrigued by a Tibetan Buddhist practice known as deity yoga. And in this practice, the practitioner, the meditator, visualizes an aspect of divinity or an aspect of enlightenment mentally, and then proceeds to identify with this mind-created deity. So if you see,
mandala right there.
yeah, it's a mandala. In Tibet, they're usually very brightly colored, but they would visualize, put together mentally that whole thing, right? And then holding it, and I've done that meditation. It is very, very difficult. It takes a lot of training. And then part of that image that you create with your mind, you visualize entering into you, which means a bit of enlightenment comes from its source into you. So by practicing, by meditating as though enlightened, enlightenment itself is attained. Try to remember that, because I'm going to come back to that point. According to the Dalai Lama sect, this technique is the highest, the most effective route to enlightenment. And Jonathan and Zalman speculate about this anthropomorphic approach to the problem of exile, and the exile not only of the people, but of God's presence itself. And they start to compare it a little bit, this anthropomorphic approach, through this deity yoga visualizations. And of course, we talk about the Dalai Lama's question about the Jewish secret. Was our survival due to our democratized emphasis upon education as a goal for all Jews? Now, many cultures value education, but I know of no other culture that says everyone should be educated. That everyone, it's a law in Judaism, to study, to learn Torah every day. Right? Not just the rabbis, not just an elite. So is that how we survived? Or was it the development of our secret vernacular languages, like Yiddish or Judesmo, or as I learned a little bit when I was living in Cochin in South India, Jewish Malayalam. Wherever Jews live, they take the local language and do something with it, adding Hebrew and Aramaic and other words into that language so that they have a way to communicate with themselves privately. Or did we survive because it was enforced from the outside because of pervasive anti-Semitism and ghettoization? One of the members of our delegation, Rebbetzin Blue Greenberg of New York City, a noted author and great teacher, and she was saying that the primacy of the home in Jewish observance replaced the temple, and thus made the religion more portable and especially equipped this religion for survival and exile. I was, long after I wrote these words and discussed this, I was reading in our Talmud, where it says that when the temple stood, we could connect to God via what's called the Shulchan HaMizbeach, the altar. Shulchan is a table, Mizbeach is like altar. So in the temple, the sacrifices would be offered on an altar, and it is through those ritual enactments that we became close to God. So the Talmud asks the question, well, what happens after the temple's destroyed? And the answer that's given is the shulchan, the table in your dining room, replaces the table of the altar at the Holy Temple. Now that takes a lot of unpacking to see. One of the key ideas in Judaism is that the transcendent, the divine, the spiritual is hiding in what we call the material. Now, what's more mundane than having a meal at your table? Food, family, that's not spiritual, right? The whole point is to unlock the secrets of the table in one's home and reveal the sacredness of the everyday living. The Talmud says, well, one way the table in the home gets us close to God is because we have guests and we can do charity to our guests. And I was never thrilled with that answer. I think this whole view of how to see in the mundane the sacred is the point. And that's all indicated by the dominance of the home as the venue for Jewish observance. Yeah, we have synagogues, we have schools, we have all that, but most of what happens in a religious Jewish home, in a religious Jewish life, happens in the home. That's one of the mysteries. And if you're in exile, you still have a home, you don't have a temple. You don't have the Shulchan HaMizbeach, but you still have your Shulchan. That was a key idea. And then I thought maybe an idea was being overlooked. I offered the belief that God's providence ensured Jewish survival. And I added, of course, whether it was belief in God, which is saying Judaism, or God himself, I couldn't say. Zalman Schachter said in Hebrew, there are two words for why. Madua and lama. The former, madua, looks for an etiology, for an origin. Why is this here? Oh, we go back to its source. And the latter, lama, why is this happening? We look to the future, towards orientation. So we go back from etiology to teleology. So Zalman phrased it very well. Are we being asked, how did we survive? Or why did we survive? And to really get it, you have to address both halves of that. And of course, finding Clifford Geertz, the great anthropologist, writes that the whole point of religion is to make suffering sufferable. We're going to suffer, we're alive. But if we're able to conceptualize that this suffering is meaningful, we can endure it, to make the unendurable endurable, to make the suffering meaningful. Just as Isaiah did with the exile to Babylonia, and just as many Tibetans did with their exile in the mid-20th century. So we're in Dharamsala, and we're invited to attend the inaugural session of the Himalayan Conference on the 5 Traditional Sciences that was being held at the Dalai Lama's monastery, known as Dekchen Choli. In his remarks before hundreds of Buddhist monks and scholars, the Dalai Lama lavishly praises Jews for their courage and great determination in preserving their religion and culture in the face of tremendous obstacles and sufferings. He says that Tibetans greatly admire Jews because no matter how they are scattered through all corners of the earth, they maintain their sense of unity of the people. And he tells the audience how lucky they are to have our delegation amongst them. Such a compliment brings tears to Jewish eyes. And now another theme for this visit is starting to take shape in my mind. One, by seeing ourselves reflected in another, we form an image of who we are. Frankly, in Christian and Muslim cultures, we Jews have seen in our reflections often condescension, and often much worse than condescension. But in Tibetan eyes now, we're seeing affection, respect, even a touch of awe, and how differently one knows oneself through such reflections. Listening to the Dalai Lama talk about us, you get the impression that we Jews survived by an act of will. I wonder, was it great determination and courage? Was it persecution? Was it God which preserved Judaism? Is there a way to translate into a Tibetan conceptual framework the idea of a transcendent justification or meaning to empirical reality? We've been invited to give a 1-hour presentation to the Himalayan Conference, a unique opportunity to speak for ourselves before a distinguished group of Asian religious leaders. And we delegate this responsibility to Rabbi Irving Greenberg, a modern Orthodox rabbi from Riverdale, New York, and who engages very often in interreligious dialogues and gets in a lot of trouble for doing it. So everyone calls him Yitz. Yitz and I work together on the format for the talk. How do we frame Judaism to this audience. And I suggest the traditional Tibetan way of analyzing religion in terms of view, path, and goal. In all the Buddhist texts, if you want to understand a faith or philosophy, what's its viewpoint? What path? How do you practice that viewpoint? And what's the goal of it? They call it Dawa, Lam, and Drebu. Yitz likes this idea. And he summarizes the Jewish view as belief in a creator who endows creation with an inherent sanctity. That's the basic view. The path involves the study of Torah, the performance of avodah, worship, or ritual connections to the transcendent, and acts of loving kindness, which are connections with one another. The Jewish goal is wholeness, which we call shlema, which is the same word as shalom. The world to come, or olam haba, and the divine human partnership to repair this world. That this world can be made into what it should be made into only when both humans and God, or when humans cooperate with God, something like that. But it's not something God's going to do to us, and it's not something we can do ourselves. I think it's a great idea, this transforming the world. Tibetan Buddhism maintains transformation as a very central metaphor. In particular, the transformation of the ordinary mind into the enlightened mind, of defilement into wisdom. Judaism, too, emphasizes transformation, the divine human partnership in transforming this world from what it is into what it ought to be. And we reflect on the interplay between the inner and outer complementary aspects of transformation. Yitz and I make a good team. His job as a rabbi is to teach about Judaism. Mine as a scholar is to find appropriate metaphors to cross cultural boundaries. And his talk goes very well. So we're getting ready for our private meetings with the Dalai Lama. And Yitz and Zalman engage in an animated discussion of what blessing to recite upon the occasion of meeting the Dalai Lama. Zalman has composed a new one for the occasion, but Yitz hesitates. We should not go about composing new liturgy, he cautions. Another rabbi who is with us, Rabbi Joy Levitt, who's from the Reconstructionist part of Judaism, Joy agrees with Yitz. For the occasion itself is sufficiently radical. There's no need to compose a new blessing. Okay, but which blessing to say? The blessing upon meeting a king, or that upon seeing a holy man? Never before has there been an occasion for a Jew to recite a blessing upon meeting a wise man of another tradition, Solomon says, and therefore a new blessing is required. And eventually a compromise is reached. Zalman will recite the traditional blessing in Hebrew, followed by my Tibetan translation of his newly composed bracha, or blessing, so that other people wouldn't know what he was saying. Finally, we have our first session with the Dalai Lama in his fairly modest palace. I first met him when I was beginning graduate work back in 1973. As a professor of religious studies, part of my job has been to meet religious leaders around the world, and I've been blessed to meet many, some saintly, most not. But not one, however, has risen in my mind to the stature of the Dalai Lama. His humor and warmth are striking, but it's his mind which impresses me the most. It goes beyond the usual sort of brilliance you often encounter in universities. His mind penetrates with just lightning rapidity. He gets to the heart of the matter more directly than anyone I've ever met or talked with. And perhaps it's the Buddhist teaching of non-egoism which creates such a flexible type of intelligence. After Zalman's blessing, I'm the first to speak, and in my halting Tibetan, I greet our hosts on behalf of the Jewish people. Now, this is a moment of fulfillment that I certainly doesn't come often. My years of study Tibetan language and culture and my deep commitments to Judaism for a moment perfectly coalesce. What are usually very different parts of my life came together as in a new role, that of an emissary of the people, a shlichi ha'am, crystallizes. And the point of my remarks were simple, that this Tibetan-Jewish dialogue is not really so entirely new. There are Sanskrit loanwords in the Hebrew Bible. There have been contacts between India and Israel ever since the time of King Solomon. That King Solomon and the Buddha actually share a legend, an identical story. And that the esoteric Tibetan system of Kalachakra Tantra, the cycle of time teachings, and Jewish millennialism may have a common source. And that for thousands of years, Jews have been intermediaries between India and the West. Now it's Zalman's turn to speak. And he describes Kabbalah and Jewish esotericism, the inner dimension, the spirituality. And his is a crucial role in this dialogue. Tibetan Buddhism is a tradition especially rich in esotericism, and Tibetans could suspect that religion, which is not likewise esoteric, might be superficial. Indeed, much of the overlap between Judaism and Tibetan Buddhism is in the esoteric, the mystical realm. And the Dalai Lama later said he found Judaism to be much more sophisticated than he had thought, in no small part a response to Zalman's animated descriptions of angels, of mysteries, of divine emanations and levels of being. There was a remarkable moment when Zalman and Dalai Lama are engaging one-on-one, and Zalman's talking about the Kabbalistic angelology, the study of angels in our tradition. And the Dalai Lama perks up. I mean, he's always interested, but he was absolutely fascinated. And he starts to pepper Zalman with questions. What color is that angel? How many legs does he have? What does he hold in this arm? And does he have wings? And all these questions. And Zalman's answering, they're going back and forth. And the Dalai Lama's consulting with some of his other lamas. And you have his heated conversations going on about angelology and Tibetan deities and so on and so on. It was quite a moment because the rest of us had no idea what they were doing. This was so far outside our grasp. But it worked. Yitz Greenberg, the modern Orthodox rabbi, discusses how in ancient times the rabbis expanded the scope of Jewish religious life and Jewish conceptions of holiness in response to exile and the loss of the temple. He's an excellent balance to Zalman's esotericism. And Yitz never fails to remind the Dalai Lama and the rest of us as well, that while mysticism is indeed a revered part of Jewish tradition and thinking, it's definitely a minority opinion. Remember what I said about deity yoga? Mm-hmm. Now, Yitz describes the Jewish observance of Shabbat. The Dalai Lama offers a remarkable comment. Yitz says that Shabbat harkens back to the creation at the same time as it anticipates the future messianic completion of the world. If you know the prayers we say on Shabbat, it goes back from creation and it goes to the future end of time. And on Shabbat, Jews live for one day as though the world were already redeemed. The Dalai Lama draws upon his own meditational tradition of deity yoga visualization to comment. You mean, he said, that Shabbat is your people's visualization exercise. Wow. How incredibly insightful and right on target. That's exactly what we do. Living for those 25 hours as though the world were redeemed, we help to bring about redemption itself. It's a tremendously deep understanding of our Shabbat practice, but frankly, one none of us would have ever thought of. The next person who speaks is Professor Paul Mendes-Flohr of the Hebrew University, now the University of Chicago, studies Jewish philosophy. And he says, I'm secular, though of course he's wearing one of these, so how secular. But his secularism complements Yitz's orthodoxy. And the Dalai Lama is very intrigued that Jews are able to embrace both secular and religious members within our family. Paul eloquently articulates the dilemma of modernity. Personal fulfillment is the watchword of the modern world, or contemporary pop spirituality. Whereas commitment to communal responsibility is the hallmark of tradition. Jews are perceived as the first people to find a balance between the two, individualism and community, providing a model that's very meaningful to other people who are first confronting the modern world. Just sort of a little aside. Paul brought from Israel some delicious Israeli oranges, and he gave them to the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama gave one to his sister-in-law, Rinchen Kendra, a wonderful woman who runs a very small guest house. Lovely, that's where I always stay in Dharamsala. Beautiful place. So she got an orange and she ate the orange. Now they have oranges in India, but they're not Jaffa oranges. They're not the same thing. So Rinchen took the seeds and tended them. Now this was 1990 when Paul brought them. Just this past October, when I was again at Rinchen guest house, there was an orange tree.
Wow.
And she said, those are from the seeds that your friend brought us from Israel, and it's bearing fruit. So interfaith dialogue bears fruits of types we can't always imagine. I could go on. Now, everyone made their presentations, all 8 of us. I can't go through all. And after all the presentations, in the spirit of the honesty that religious dialogue requires, on behalf of us, I raised a painful, difficult issue with the Dalai Lama, that of Jews who join other religions, including Tibetan Buddhism. Your Holiness, I say, I must speak with candor. There remains one issue which pains us. You have seen our deep sense of family. And it's very painful for us when one of our family chooses to leave us. On the one hand, it's clear that Jewish people who adopt the Tibetan path benefit greatly as individuals. On the other hand, we suffer from a spiritual brain drain on a community level. Many of our finest, most intelligent, most spiritually inclined people are leaving us. Sir, I'm not asking you a question. I'm not asking you to make a statement. But on behalf of my people, I must tell you, frankly, how we feel. The Dalai Lama is taken aback somewhat by my comment. The Buddhist attitude is not to seek converts in the first place. But at the same time, it makes no distinction among peoples. Anyone who wants the teachings of the Buddha is entitled to them. Religion knows no national boundary for them. He explains further the Buddhist belief that the Buddha offered differing teachings to students of differing personalities. Therefore, no one religious doctrine could satisfy everyone. His advice, however, is both understanding and sage. If you want to keep your people in your religion, then you must open your doors to spirituality. If you have esoteric traditions to offer them, they won't want to leave. He continued, as a result of our meeting, to speak quite frankly, I developed much more respect for Judaism because I found there a high level of sophistication. I think it's very important for you to make these teachings available for everyone, especially intellectual people. And sometimes there's a danger in too much secrecy. Often qualified people could be excluded from the practice, so it's best to be more flexible. I have seen many similarities between your tradition and ours. If you make these teachings available, why would your people want Buddhist Tantra? You have your own Tantra. Many of your people have keen intelligence, very creative minds. And if they're not personally satisfied with what you offer them, then nobody could stop them from leaving and taking a new religion. Provide them with all the materials, the spiritual teachings. If you have spiritual values, then there's no reason to fear. And if you have no such values, then there's no reason to hold on. If you cannot provide spiritual satisfaction to others, and at the same time insist on holding on to them, then that is foolishness. This, he concludes, is reality. He's entirely right. But a little bit later, the next day, I think it was, he revisits this theme, and it troubled him. And he asks us, why is it so difficult for you to learn Jewish esoteric teachings? Why won't your teachers make these available to sincere intellectual people? Rabbi Moshe Wallachs, an author from Massachusetts, replies, now we must speak about the Holocaust. First time it's mentioned. Usually it's the first item on agendas of dialogue. Comes in much later. Moshe said, during this period, 1/3 of our people were exterminated. But more than 80% of our rabbis and teachers were murdered too. Our esoteric traditions died in Hitler's ovens. Unblinking, the Dalai Lama joined us in peering into this abyss. It was a wordless moment of deep empathy and understanding. And let me back up a little bit to explain that a little more. Any esoteric tradition, Sufi, Kabbalah, Tantra, Zen, whatever it is, depends more than anything else on what Tibetans call the ear-whispered Tantra, the intimate relation between a teacher and a student. I was discussing with someone about trying to read Tantric texts and compare it to reading some Kabbalistic texts. And you can know the language backwards and forwards, and if you sit down with the Zohar, you're not going to know what it means. It's not a language problem. But if you learn the Zohar with a teacher who knows it, they can open up the keys to those texts so you can understand. And once the teachers are gone, if they're killed, the rupture is irreparable. That's why it was such an abyss. You go back to New Delhi, and everyone has left, but I decided to stay on for a few days. I'm going to meet with some of the leaders of the city's Jewish and Tibetan communities to tell them about this dialogue. And since my wife so kindly let me go, I had to do some shopping. But having a few days to myself gave me time to think about these past couple weeks. For an observant Jew, participation in this sort of dialogue must raise issues of avodah zarah, a derogatory term meaning other people's worship, something to be avoided by observant Jews. In unpolite circles, it means idolatry. So is Tibetan Buddhism avodah zarah, or is it another approach to God? Blue said that when she told her father where she was going, he was even more upset than when she supported women's Orthodox ordination. And her father began studying the Talmudic tractate on avodah zarah. You see, what's relatively easy for modern secularists is fraught with difficulties for someone traditionally religious. Yet the question's not so simple. There are authorities in the rabbinic world that had rather liberal views regarding other religions, and somehow this liberal thread through centuries became more and more the background. There's no monolithic view in the texts. Our delegation contains some remarkable individuals, and we blended into a strong team. And I talk about what each person's contribution, and I see the time. I admired the people I was with, and I admired the Dalai Lama more than before. He uniquely inspires others. Even before we first met him in this event, somehow all of us knew that we'd have to rise to this occasion spiritually. Through our prayers, through the rarefied environment of Dharamsala, through the inspiration of all those whom we represented, we were able to do so. We were able to approach his level. And I think it's the highest any of us had ever been. Coming out of this dialogue, we have learned something about the Tibetan people, their remarkable culture, and their heroic efforts to maintain that culture. But more important, and here's about interfaith dialogue. More important, however, is that now all of us know ourselves differently than we had before. Of course, we learned a great deal from the other Jewish delegates. It was a very learned, very articulate group. But deeper than that, we've now seen ourselves reflected by a new other, a Tibetan other, an other which knows us in respect and affection. And having seen this reflection of respect and affection, perhaps we can generate those feelings towards ourselves. At that moment, I felt opened spiritually and emotionally as well as intellectually. The dialogues were so much of the heart. Each session opened and concluded with expressions of mutual affection. We Jews have always felt ourselves to be a light unto the nations, that we have something valuable and unique to offer the world. How marvelous it was to meet eager recipients of that message, and how singularly rare. Dialogue, it is said, transforms both participants. This one certainly did.